unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare recess at any time during the hearing. Without objection, so ordered. As the chair of today's hearing, I will make good faith effort to provide every member experiencing connectivity issues an opportunity to fully participate in the proceedings. Please let the committee staff know as soon as possible if you are experiencing connectivity issues or have technical problems. It is the responsibility of each member seeking recognition to unmute their microphone to speak to avoid any uh, inadvertent background noise. I request that every member keep their microphone muted when not seeking recognition to speak. Should I hear any inadvertent background noise, I will stop and request the member to please mute their microphone. And finally, to insert a document to the record, please have your staff email documents to tni@mail.house.gov. Now, to the topic of the hearing. Today, we begin the subcommittee's oversight over the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers by discussing steps to implement Water Resources and Development Act of 2020. The Corps is, simply put, the nation's premier water resources agency. Congress has vested the Corps with significant responsibility to carry out vital projects for navigation, flood damage reduction, ecosystem restoration, water supply, and a host of other very critical project purposes. It is critical that the Corps prioritize immediate implementation of critical policies enacted in the WRDA to address the protection and well-being of our communities and environment, as well as to meet the maintenance needs of our water resources infrastructure, both of which are so critical to our national, regional, and local economies. This committee, on a bipartisan basis, has successfully enacted 4 consecutive Water Resources Development Acts since 2014. Regular enactment of WRDA is critical because of the predictability it provides to sponsors who partner with the Corps for development of feasibility studies for future water resources development projects. At the same time, regular enactment of WRDA also gives Congress the opportunity to provide regular oversight and direction to the Corps on how it should develop and implement these projects. The subcommittee has a very unique interest in how the Corps implements WRDA laws. We want to know that the Corps implements the laws expeditiously as Congress intended and ensure the Corps remains responsive to national, regional, local priorities and to a changing climate with a proper budget to address the issue. WRDA 2020 demonstrated the strong bipartisan support for increasing resiliency of our infrastructure and finally providing the Corps with the tools outlined over a decade ago to address new and increasing challenges of our water infrastructure in a way that improves our environment, addresses social inequities, and stimulates economic opportunity. I am specifically interested in water provisions. We included that improved national dam safety programs, the inclusion of nature-based alternatives, and the consideration of a community's water supply needs as a primary mission for the Corps. My district include Corps dams built many years ago, many over 50 years ago, that need both safety improvements and revisions of their outdated water control manuals to more effectively help communities with the water supply. I am also proud of policies in WRDA 2020 that will engage more communities, especially minority and tribal communities, in the core process and provide them with better access to those beneficial projects. I hope those provisions addressing environmental justice concerns, repetitive flooding, affordability will be among the top priorities for the Corps implementation. I would also like to emphasize the importance of changes made in WRDA 2020 that unlock additional funds for harbor maintenance, yes, needed around the country. My region includes the largest port in the nation, the Port of Los Angeles and the Port of Long Beach. I am glad to have Jean Soroka, hello Jean, from the Port of Los Angeles here today to discuss the backlog of maintenance needs for our ports and harbors and how WRDA 2020 will provide critical support in ensuring the viability and efficiency of our ports for decades to come. The committee leadership will send a letter to President Biden on January Pardon me, it was February 12th, urging administration to move quickly to unlock the trust fund and spend the harbor maintenance dollars authorized in the bill. I would like to thank the entire panel of stakeholders who are here today who will help us to understand the impacts and the importance of these policies once they are fully implemented. As the Corps develops implementation guidance for the policy provisions included in Water 2020, your perspectives and insight will be critical to prioritizing issues that will have the greatest benefit to our nation. And this time, I am very pleased to yield to my colleague, the ranking member of our subcommittee, Mr. Rouser, for any thoughts he may have.
Thank you, Chair Napolitano, for holding this hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today to discuss the important work of the Army Corps of Engineers. In particular, I'd like to thank Dr. Michael Peeler, Director of the Institute for the Environment at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, for taking the time to appear with us today and provide his expert testimony. Welcome, Dr. Peeler. I'm proud to serve on this committee, which has passed 4 major transformational water laws during the last 4 Congresses to improve our nation's water resources infrastructure. Given this tremendous accomplishment, I would like to see the Corps expeditiously implement the significant reforms made by these laws. As we look forward to future water resources legislation, one issue that cannot be overlooked is the inland and coastal flooding that has occurred across the nation. All areas of North Carolina, from coastal and surrounding counties to the mountains, have experienced significant flooding events on numerous occasions. Most recently in November, Tropical Storm Ada hit North Carolina hard, resulting in flooding that caused 12 deaths, required dozens of people to be rescued, and caused more than $20 million in damages. In addition, there's been Hurricane Florence in 2018, Matthew in 2016, Floyd in 1999, and Fran in 1996, to name just a few of these devastating flood events. Historic flooding, such as this, should spur us to re-examine infrastructure to ensure it is updated and capable of protecting life and property. These disasters pose an important question to Congress. What can we do to help prevent future flooding? And equally important, how can we improve infrastructure within our states to reduce the risk of dam and levee breaches, flooded homes and businesses, and to better protect our coast? In addition to storm events, we've seen significant economic loss in places throughout the country where barges and boats can no longer navigate our inland waterways. Much of this waterborne commerce is dependent on infrastructure that was initially constructed in the 1970s, 60s, or earlier, and is quickly approaching the end of its design life. So as we reflect on this flooding, the hardship and devastation it brings, and the other issues our nation faces with aging water infrastructure, it's important for this committee to continue its bipartisan commitment to work and pass critical water resources legislation. Our citizens cannot afford the devastating effects of floods to their homes, farms, businesses, and communities. We owe the American people our absolute best efforts to help with this. I look forward to hearing about the implementation of WARDA 2020 from our witnesses and the previous but more recent WARDAs as well, hearing constructive ideas from the experts that we have before us today. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rouser. At this time, I'm pleased to yield to the chairman of the full committee, Mr. DeFazio, for any thoughts he may have.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We're kicking off now what will be the 5th consecutive 2-year reauthorization of the Water Resources Development Act. This was initiated by my predecessor and friend, Bill Schuster, after many years of erratic reauthorizations and long lapses many times. And I want to thank those who were key in this legislation last year. My ranking member, Sam Graves, the chair, Grace Napolitano, and former subcommittee ranking member, Bruce Resterman. And I know now that Dave Rouser is going to be a great partner, and we're going to get the 5th one in a row done. The last year authorized the construction of all 46 pending reports, Of course, the Corps does have a substantial backlog and needs additional funding, and that's something to be discussed as we move forward. Regular enactment of WRDA sends, a signal of predictability, both to the Corps and to non-federal sponsors that we can and will, even in a bitterly divided Congress, on a bipartisan basis, authorize water resources development projects in a transparent and efficient manner, and hopefully address local challenges, as a number of which the ranking member mentioned regarding his state. It also was a finalization of something that I started working on not with Bill Schuster, but with Bud Schuster, his dad, who chaired this committee in the 90s, and that was unlocking the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund. This was a long struggle, twice in the minority. When Bill was moving the bill, I got this committee to unanimously support unlocking the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, but twice Speaker Ryan had the Rules Committee pull it out of the bill. Luckily, last year, Speaker Pelosi was totally in concert with unlocking the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, and we finally got it done. And this year, I expect the Corps has told us that they have the capacity to fully obligate $2 billion. That'll be the largest one-year expenditure that I can remember for the backlog of needed harbor maintenance around the country. And then I want to thank again my ranking member, Sam Graves, for joining me in a letter earlier this year to the Biden administration to say, please, in your budget, fully utilize these funds. And I'm hopeful that we will see that reflected in the near future. It also gave some recognition to inland waterways, which were also mentioned by the ranking member. I've visited some that were in Connor Lamb's district that actually were built in the 18th or the 19th century, the 19th century, the end of the 19th century. We had some great engineers back then, but these things have a life limit, and we're losing and have potential to lose critical inland navigation of the most efficient way to move freight, which is on water. We've got to maintain this fabulous system that we inherited, from the very early days, actually, of the Republic. We gave the Corps some new direction that, they build and rebuild resilient to climate change effects. That'll be sea level rise, severe weather events, and other issues that we know are going to arise with more frequency over the coming years, and also that the needs of economically disadvantaged minority, rural, and tribal communities are better addressed. There are times where the Corps has not recognized tribes as sovereign nations with whom they have to have meaningful dialogue before moving forward with projects which impact them. And then it also directs the Corps finally to implement changes to planning guidance that Congress established in 2007. It's 14 years. I think we can get that done. The changes and principles we put in will maximize sustainable development, protect and restore the functions of natural systems, and affordably address the needs of economically disadvantaged rural, small, and tribal communities. And it fully integrates resiliency into the Corps' planning and design process to help our communities meet the future challenges of changing hydrologic conditions, repetitive and more frequent flooding events. And 2020 bill also assured that all communities, especially communities with socioeconomic challenges, have a path forward in getting the tools they need for flood protection ecosystem legislation. And it finally directs the Corps to update its policies related to environmental justice and to ensure water resources development projects can help to ameliorate disproportionate and adverse health and environmental impacts on low-income, minority communities, and Indian tribes. So, Madam Chair, I thank you for holding this hearing today and kicking off what I fully expect to be the 5th consecutive, successful, bipartisan reauthorization of water resources, and heck, who knows, maybe even the Senate will be able to pass it this time without having to put it into a year-end budget deal. And I also, if you just give me license, I just want to say that it's good to see our first witness here today, Matt Strickler. Matt was a key member of my staff when I was the ranking member on the Resources Committee a number of years ago, and I congratulate him on the position he has adopted and look forward to his testimony. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. DeFazio, and I couldn't agree with you more. Next, thank you very much. We will proceed to hear from our witnesses who will testify with us today. Thank you for being here and very welcome. On today's panel, we have Matthew Strickler, the chair of the full committee, just introduced him, Secretary of Natural Resources, Commonwealth of Virginia, Jean Soroka, Executive Director, Port of Los Angeles, California, Mary Ann Bucci, Executive Director, Port of Pittsburgh Commission, Michael Peeler, Director, UNC Institute for Environment, Chad Berginis, Executive Director, Association of State Floodplain Managers. Without objection, your prepared statements will be entered into the record, and all witnesses are asked to limit their remark to 5 minutes. Mr. Strickler, Secretary Strickler, it's good to see you again, and I truly appreciate the work you did for the previous chairman, Grijalva, also, and working for me and my staff when you were on the House Natural Resources Committee. I'm glad you're here today in your current role with the state of Virginia, and you may proceed.
Well, thank you, Chairman Napolitano and Chairman DeFazio, for your kind words and for having me here this morning, and Ranking Member Rouser as well, and all the members of the subcommittee. It's good to see you. Appreciate being here to talk today on the important topic of the Water Resources Development Act of 2020. As was mentioned, my name is Matt Strickler. I serve as the Secretary of Natural Resources and the Chief Resilience Officer to Virginia Governor Ralph Northam. Virginia faces massive challenges in adapting to the new reality created by climate change and sea level rise. And as we tackle these challenges, the provisions of WRDA 2020 and increased federal engagement will be crucial. When our Special Assistant for Coastal Adaptation and Protection, retired U.S. Navy Admiral Ann Phillips, testified before the subcommittee in November 2019, she detailed the specific threats to Virginia's coastal communities, and I refer you to her statement from that hearing, as well as my longer written testimony that I've submitted today for that background. Admiral Phillips also outlined Governor Northam's executive actions to create a comprehensive framework for coastal planning in Virginia and to institute the country's strongest flood risk management standard. Since then, we have developed and released the Virginia Coastal Resilience Master Planning Framework and are on track to complete our first project-driven master plan by this fall. We've also joined RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and are dedicating nearly half of the proceeds from carbon allowances to our Community Flood Preparedness Fund for fighting both coastal and inland flooding. These are big steps, but even the most proactive states can't fight this battle on their own. Virginia will need the assistance of the federal government and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers specifically. Through the development of our master planning framework, Virginia has advanced 5 key principles for adaptation and resilience. And while they're included in a coastal plan, these principles are largely applicable to river and floodplains as well. They also align with many of the reforms this committee developed in WRDA 2020. First, Virginia is committed to acknowledging climate change and its consequences and basing decision-making on the best available science. Steps in WRDA 2020 to ensure the Corps quantifies efforts to address sea level rise or inland flooding and cost-benefit analyses will help Virginia as it weighs which projects it should prioritize. This will also help us understand the true effectiveness of different approaches, as well as the costs and risks associated with incompatible development. As Virginia works to identify and address socioeconomic inequality and enhance equity through adaptation, several provisions of WRDA 2020 will be useful. Directing the Corps to prioritize planning assistance to economically disadvantaged communities and to communities subject to repetitive flooding will help those that have traditionally lacked adequate resources. Updates to the Corps environmental justice policies to ensure that future projects promote meaningful involvement of minority communities, low-income communities, and federally recognized Indian tribes also support Virginia's initiatives. Virginia is committed to protecting and enhancing green infrastructure like natural coastal barriers and fish and wildlife habitat by prioritizing natural and nature-based solutions. This too aligns with the provisions of WRDA 2020, supporting natural and nature-based projects by ensuring these alternatives are fully evaluated, and any flood risk reduction feasibility study carried out by the Corps is critically important. Similarly, since Virginia will utilize community and regional scale planning to the maximum extent possible, authorizing the Corps to study, design, and construct water resources projects for communities that have been subjected to repetitive flooding events and those that have received emergency flood assistance will be helpful in directing resources to areas of need and to providing community scale planning. Finally, we need to understand the fiscal realities and focus on the most cost-effective solutions for protection and adaptation. Provisions of WRDA 2020 that require the Corps to assess and update the economic and environmental impacts of antiquated projects before they may be carried out is important, and will put Virginia on a more level playing field with other states as we all grapple with emerging climate risks. The policy changes from WRDA 2020 will help Virginia's flood preparedness efforts. While these changes are in the early stages of implementation, they represent major shifts in the Corps' approach that are necessary as we begin the daunting task of adapting to a rapidly changing climate. While this hearing is focused on implementation, we hope the subcommittee will consider changes in future water resources bills that will allow for more than 10 core flood risk management studies per year, remove the $3 million cap on such studies, and include federal property in the studies. This would allow the Corps to play a larger and more effective role in state-level flood control and master planning efforts. Further, we would urge the Corps and the subcommittee to reconsider the sea level rise projections being used to engineer and evaluate projects. The Corps' intermediate curve underestimates sea level rise in Norfolk, Virginia, for example, by more than 2 feet in 2060 when compared to the NOAA intermediate high curve adopted independently by both the Commonwealth and the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission. I thank you for your consideration and look forward to answering your questions today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Strickler. And now we proceed to Mr. Soroka. It's good to see you, and thank you for being here today and for representing the Port of Los Angeles as well as hundreds of other ports in the nation. Thank you for your advocacy for the many years on harbor maintenance that are very important to the nation. And thank you for your recent work guiding the port through the challenges of COVID on our port economy, public health, national economy. You may proceed.
Thank you, and good morning, Chair DeFazio, Chairwoman Napolitano, Ranking Member Rouser, members of the House Subcommittee on Water Resources, Environment, and other distinguished members of Congress. Before I begin, I'd like to take this opportunity to congratulate you, Chairman DeFazio, for your recent recognition as Port Person of the Year by the American Association of Port Authorities. As well, congratulations to you, Chairwoman Napolitano, for receiving the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Gold de Fleury Medal for your support of U.S. Army Corps projects. The passage of Water Resources Development Act of 2020 stands as a memorial for both your courage and boldness in pursuing reforms that are beneficial for ports and harbors across the United States. Thank you for this opportunity to testify this morning. My name is Eugene D. Soroka, and I'm the Executive Director at the Port of Los Angeles. I also concurrently serve as President of the California Association of Port Authorities and as board member of the American Association of Port Authorities. The Port of Los Angeles is the nation's largest and busiest container port. The cargo that traverses our port reaches each and every one of our 435 congressional districts. This truly is a conversation of national significance. In 2020, we managed more than 9.2 million container units, which generated over $275 billion in economic impact and nearly 1.6 million jobs nationwide. On average, the Port of Los Angeles accounts for over $200 million per year in receipts that go into the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund. We are grateful for the work that your staff and you have done to open the use of the Hmtf through the recent passage of WRDA 2020. This landmark legislation included reforms we and the broader port community have sought for the last 10 years, including full use of Hmtf revenues, a fair and equitable allocation framework, and expanded uses. Full use of annual revenues and the unspent fund balance will increase funding and accessibility for all types of ports across the country at a time when we need to invest in the competitiveness of our nation's ports. A fair and equitable allocation framework ensures that every port region of the country, including traditional dredge ports, emerging harbors, and donor ports alike, will receive a fair share of the Hmtf expenditure each year. WRDA's 2020 expanded uses definition enables ports like ours to address urgent maintenance needs. While we do not require frequent dredging, the new eligible uses will allow us to address $300 to $500 million worth of in-water maintenance projects over the next 10 years, including wharf repairs, replacement of berthing structures, and the all-important seismic upgrades. These reforms have an impact, and it is imperative that Congress and federal agencies take additional steps. First, I urge Congress to implement the Hmtf budget cap adjustment initially included in the CARES Act and expanded in WRDA 2020. This will give the Army Corps of Engineers the full prior year's Hmtf revenues and the scheduled amount of unspent collections. Second, as you develop spending plans for the next year, I urge you to implement WRDA's Hmtf distribution approach. This would minimize any disruption to planned maintenance repairs and projects across the country. And third, with respect to donor ports, the new funding distribution mechanism for Hmtf collections should model the system in place for Section 2106. The protocol that we use with the Corps works well, and using an existing model can help avoid unintended consequences that may delay funding disbursements. Once again, thank you for the opportunity to testify on the importance of WRDA implementation. The port industry, represented by AAPA, stands unified in support. With that, I'll conclude my testimony, and I'd be happy to entertain any questions from the subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Soroka. Next, we have Ms. Marianne Bucci, Executive Director for Port of Pittsburgh Commission. You may proceed.
Madam Chair Napolitano, Ranking Member Rouser, and Chair DeFazio, and members of the subcommittee, I thank you for this opportunity to be here today to talk about WRDA 2020. I will focus on the importance of water resource development legislation, Congress's role in continuing to build on previous successes, the need for full use of the Inland Waterways Trust Fund, the adoption of the capital investment strategy, and the reinstatement of the Inland Waterway User Board to build back better. American inland waterways is the best in the world, but it has its challenges as international competitors continue to improve their system and facilities. More than half the locks and dams in the U.S. inland waterway system are past their 50-year design life and require attention and financial recapitalization and reliability to sustain the nation's economic well-being and standard of living. The attention starts with reinstating the User Board. The User Board provides recommendations to Congress and the Secretary of the Army on investment priorities using resources from the trust fund, which the commercial users have contributed for with construction and major rehab of the inland navigation investment priorities. I strongly encourage the board be reinstated, given that it is filled with industry leaders and subject matter experts. This relationship fosters collaborative conversation between the Corps and the stakeholders and fulfills the user pay, user save policy. The Lower Mon project, which has encountered dramatic cost escalations and schedule delays, is currently funded to completion until 2023. The project authorized in 1992. However, inadequate funding forced the Corps to complete the project one component at a time or as funding allowed. Currently, the Lower Mon project is in its 27th year of construction, and the Lower Mon also experiences the most volume and locks on the river system. The second project, Olmsted Lock and Dam, was authorized in 1998 at $775 million. That project ballooned to $3.1 billion. Thankfully, toward 2014, had one significant reduction of the Inland Waterway Trust Fund, where that project alone went from 50% to 15%. The second provision was the authorize the users of the inland waterways taking a tax increase of 45% to its current rate of 29 cents per gallon to contribute additional funds to get these projects moving. What that allowed was additional funding to be spent on other projects, including Chickamauga Lock and Dam and Kentucky Lock and Dam. In 2016, the Upper Ohio Navigation Project, which will modernize and upgrade the 3 oldest locks on the Ohio River, including Montgomery Lock and Dam, that was recently given a New Start designation and awarded $22 million in the 2021 work plan. What's important is that is the first New Start designation that was given since 2004 on any inland waterways construction project. It's critical to the nation for that reason, so we can get other projects authorized, and also to the Ohio River, because if anything on the Upper Ohio fails, that would be a total lock closure in the Port of Pittsburgh. So since a WRDA bill has been done every 2 years with overwhelming bipartisan support, it added efficiencies and helped move projects forward on these lock and dam projects, which is very important on the inland waterways. With the adjustment, it is also important that the trust funds receipts are appropriated so that we can reduce the inland waterway construction backlog. Many of your colleagues support a robust infrastructure package that will provide jobs and increase efficiencies and reduce emissions. I would like to emphasize that the infrastructure upgrades on our inland waterways will help the nation achieve those goals. In consultation with the user board, the capital investment strategy recognizes the importance of construction and major rehab necessary to modernize the nation's waterway system using objective prioritizing criteria and processes to focus on investments where they matter most. As you move forward with the potential infrastructure package, I encourage you to include funding for the locks and dams. In closing, I want to reiterate the fact that beyond enabling commercial transportation, the inland waterways provides recreational access, stable water supplies for communities and industries that facilitates hydroelectric power. Modernizing our ports and rivers is an investment in our nation's continued economic prosperity because many of our commodities and over 500,000 jobs are riding on our waterways transportation system. Thank you for the opportunity today, and I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Bucci, very much. And next we have Michael Peeler, PhD, Director, UNC Institute for Environment. And you may proceed, sir.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairwoman Napolitano, Ranking Member Rouser, the committee and staff. I appreciate the opportunity to share our experience with research and translating actionable information around flood resilience. North Carolina is an excellent model system to consider the essential provisions of WRDA 2020. Our state has a fairly modest 322 miles of ocean coastline, but a remarkable 12,009 miles of inland shoreline woven throughout the coastal plain. With 2 ports and a diverse water-reliant economy, North Carolina has benefited tremendously from the work of the Corps. North Carolina has also had more experience than we'd like with storms, including having had 36 hurricanes affect us since the late 1990s, and 6 of the 7 biggest rain events in the last 120 years occur over just the last 20 years. Our research team was established through 2 programs, the Creativity Hubs and the Collaboratory at UNC, both of which target investments in research addressing societal challenges. Recently, our team also received a grant from the growing Convergence Research program at the National Science Foundation. We are grateful for the taxpayers' investment in our work, and we are enthusiastic about the contributions we can make to moving coastal communities forward. Convergence research is an approach to formulate and apply research to tackle complex problems with societal relevance. It requires deep integration across disciplines and in many cases engages and integrates stakeholders and end users early. Our team has the shared goal to provide new information to reduce damage from flood and storms, thus creating economic, environmental, and social benefits. A focal area for our program, Wilmington is North Carolina's largest coastal city and port, and it is an area that relies on critical natural infrastructure, including marshes and beaches, but faces emerging challenges such as harmful algal blooms. The region has an engaged citizenry and local governments working for environmental and economic balance and the inclusions of communities and resilience policy. 3 features of our program have enhanced its effectiveness and are relevant to key aspects of WRDA 2020. They include deep engagement with stakeholders and end users, connections to financial risk and models, and reliance on quantitative social science for our inquiries. Efforts to answer questions related to population well-being require engagement with stakeholders and end users. Through a comprehensive effort at our program's inception, we developed a more robust set of project goals by incorporating the perspective of the resilience community in North Carolina, and at the same time confirmed that we were developing solutions for priority problems. A large portion of our program emphasizes explicit connections to financial considerations. Using coupled models which link environmental change to financial risk is a novel method to determine overall community risk from flooding. Quantifying flood risk and losses associated with insurers, property owners, lenders, and local governments improves each group's understanding of its own risk, but also acts as a basis for developing more sophisticated strategies for managing risk. This type of highly resolved analysis is unique in that it characterizes risk at the individual property level for thousands of parcels within a community, which are then used to aggregate distributions of risk for the entire community while also identifying the holders of the risk. Considering ecosystem services, the monetary value of natural processes to people, we were able to connect the function of natural systems to other financial analyses. Components of ecosystems with the potential to provide benefits related to flooding include marshes, reef-forming bivalves, submerged aquatic vegetation. Looking first through the lens of quantitative social sciences, we've fused engineering and social sciences, policy and planning to seek solutions to the challenges around flooding. To date, research in this realm has typically focused first on the natural portion of these coupled natural human systems. Our process began with quantitative inquiries of the human dimension, which results in a reframed and refocused set of research approaches and solutions better suited to the needs of all communities. How might our experiences as a research team be of value to this group in implementing WRDA 2020? From our perspective, here are 3 important steps. Include guidance to funding recipients regarding explicit consideration of connections to financial systems. Require a comprehensive stakeholder engagement program, forming diverse teams with broad disciplinary perspectives. Include qualitative social science as a key component of technical assessments. Sustaining the economy and the environment around quickly changing aquatic systems is a grand challenge, but it can be met, and it is clear that WRDA 2020 is poised to contribute to meeting this challenge. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate your testimony. And next, we have Mr. Chad McGinnis, last but not least, the Executive Director of Association of State Floodplain Managers. You may proceed, sir.
Great. Good morning, Chair Napolitano, Ranking Member Rouser, and members of the subcommittee. I am Chad McGinnis, Executive Director of the Association of State Floodplain Managers, and I'm honored to be with you today to discuss our views and considerations for implementing the 2020 WRDA. Eureka! While it's a fitting one-word reaction by ASFPM to the 2020 WRDA, it is also the name of a small Missouri city whose story is just being written. 3 days ago, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch wrote about this community's struggle with flooding, yet many residents not wanting the traditional new big levee. Nope, instead, with the help of the Corps, they are thinking about flood risk management differently. They are evaluating dozens of options, including some use of levees and flood walls, but also buyouts, relocation, or elevation to high-risk properties, the restoration of floodplains as water storage areas, and expanded use of green infrastructure. It also includes consideration of technologically advanced temporary barriers and harnessing the power of natural processes to store and absorb floodwaters. It's about fighting a more erratic and changing climate with every tool in the toolbox, improving community resiliency, and yet not transferring flooding to adjacent communities. But this too is the legacy of the 2020 WRDA, namely expanding the Corps' ability to provide technical assistance and expanding the flood risk management toolbox. However, implementation of the provisions will require careful oversight by you and thoughtful implementation by the Corps. Our written testimony identifies 11 specific actions for either the Corps or the committee to consider as implementation of WRDA 2020 unfolds. To summarize, we want to highlight 4 broad areas of WRDA 2020 that hold the greatest promise. First, WRDA 2020 includes a substantial agenda of resiliency policy improvements and expanded non-structural, natural, and nature-based features as working tools in the Corps' toolbox for flood risk management, such as the clear addition of natural and nature-based alternatives with the same cost sharing as structural projects, and incentives to recognize the non-monetary benefits and estimates of long-term cost and benefits of such alternatives. More and more communities leaders in the nation are realizing that many of the non-structural approaches are well suited to reduce risk at a systemic level and a corridor scale. We wish to highlight the Corps of the Corps' Engineering with Nature initiative and recommend that the Corps fully commit to supporting the operationalization of EWN through the agency. Second is the increased emphasis on technical support for states, communities, tribes, territories, and especially rural and economically disadvantaged communities to assess and manage flood risk. ASFPM has long supported technical assistance programs such as floodplain management services and planning assistance to states. Your improvements to FPMS in the WRDA 2020, for example, to include helping communities avoid repetitive flooding impacts, adapting to changing climate conditions and extreme weather events, and the priority for economically disadvantaged communities are all important areas of focus. We note, however, that the provision of technical assistance within the Corps will be limited until there is a fundamental restructuring of how it's provided, moving away from the project-based approach and embracing a programmatic discretionary use approach with sufficient staffing in every single Corps district. Another aspect of technical assistance is leadership and commitment to emerging technologies. ASFPM recommends the Corps evaluate and adopt the latest standards for flood abatement technologies, as well as ensuring suitable water testing laboratory facilities for flood fighting products. Third, we note the importance of the lower and upper Missouri River comprehensive flood protection studies and the required inclusion of both structural and non-structural measures, including the setting back of levees, removing of structures from areas of recurring flooding vulnerability, and nature-based features. Given the added policy flexibility, the Missouri River Comprehensive Flood Protection Study has the potential to advance efforts to expand the uses of non-structural approaches in a very meaningful way. As was stated earlier, not only in communities like Eureka, but others like Arnold, Missouri, are rejecting traditional approaches as they eye a more integrated and comprehensive way to address flood risk. Finally, the directive to implement a water resources principle and requirements to review and revise planning guidance and regulations will update woefully out-of-date planning guidance and assure that the PRNG requires federal agencies to fully account for environmental costs and benefits, as well as the analysis for future conditions and water resources planning. Thank you for this opportunity to provide our thoughts to you today, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, sir. I appreciate your testimony and all of you. Thank you for all our witnesses. We will now have the question for the witnesses. And again, we'll use the timers for each question from each member. If there are additional questions, we may have a second round or more as necessary. I will begin the questioning with Mr. DeFazio. I'll defer to him for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. To Secretary Strickler, something you said in your testimony about the current estimated sea level rise by the Corps you find to be totally inadequate. Could you address that a bit more?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the question. It is my understanding that the Army Corps is using its own intermediate sea level rise curve for engineering and planning purposes and evaluation of projects. That curve estimates and projects significantly less sea level rise than the other curves, particularly the NOAA intermediate high curve, but even lower NOAA curves that are being used for planning. In Virginia, we're using the NOAA intermediate high curve, which shows that in the next 20 years in our Hampton Roads area, we're going to be seeing at least another 18 inches of sea level rise with closer to 4 feet by 2060. And that's there's a significant gap there, about 2 feet difference between that and the Corps' intermediate projection. So that's a pretty big deal with the lifespan of some of these larger projects. 2 feet can be the difference between having, houses and businesses being protected and having their first floor be covered with water during floods. So that's a concern for us, and it's one that we'd like to see updated and synced, hopefully across the federal government. And that's something that we think that you all and the Biden-Harris administration can work together on.
Well, thanks for bringing that up, and it's certainly something I will raise with Jane Lubchenco when she gets into her new job, and she's somewhat of an expert on these issues, and have the administration address that generally, both through the Corps and other agencies. To Professor Peeler, if I could kind of distill down what you said, the way you're measuring and setting up for resilience measures is kind of a new way of a cost-benefit ratio, looking at it, don't you think, compared to what the Corps currently uses?
I do think that's accurate. It is work being done on the Center on Financial Risk and Environmental Systems at our university. And what it does is directly couple the environmental models to the financial models. So then rather than feeding in relatively simple scenarios like a 1% likelihood of an event occurring into a financial model, you're coupling the two models and you're able to capture the dynamics of both the environment and whatever the financial system is that you're interested in.
Right, and you're looking specifically, I mean, you said you were going down to essentially the individual parcel level for people?
That's accurate, yes. There are a lot of data out there that I think have not been fully utilized, and in this individual project, for sure, that is the level of resolution.
That's really interesting. I think that's something the committee should be looking at and perhaps modeling for the future. There would also be a public benefit far beyond that, since many of these losses or the financial things you're measuring would be under the flood insurance program. Isn't that correct?
That's absolutely correct, yes. And that's a source of some of the data, but I also think it's a comparison between the data that we're using in our study and those that have been used in NFIP.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, sir, very much. The next we have Mr. Rouser. Mr. Rouser, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you again, Dr. Peeler, for joining us here today. I am, as most folks know, I'm an NC State Wolfpack alumnus, but today I'm a Carolina fan, and I really appreciate you being here. Now, you mentioned the term Convergence Research in your testimony, and you note that, quote, flooding is a transdisciplinary challenge and cannot be solved with individual expertise, but rather requires the integration of multiple concepts to develop new perspectives. There's a lot packed into that. How would you describe how convergence research can be applied to reduce damage from floods and storms, and as a result, create economic, environmental, and social benefits?
So moving away from the academic definition of convergence, I think there's a practical definition. And what it involves is getting the necessary experts together ahead of time and not forming individual concepts for investigating a problem independently, but rather working as a group. And there's a lot of conversation around developing a shared language. And I think that's really true, that working in individual disciplines, the perspectives are so focused that you don't necessarily have a sense of all of the allied issues that other experts are thinking about. So the breadth of our group was established through those original funding sources that I described, and we've been able to work together collectively for almost 2 years now and have gotten to the point where our engineers understand the things that our natural scientists are saying and understand the things that our social scientists are saying, and are able to frame the whole of the question. For me, flooding is an issue where if you know where the water is going, how deep it is and how long it's there, that's great, but that doesn't tell you what the impacts are on the community, and that doesn't give you a really clear sense of the financial implications. So convergence is a popular term right now to describe bringing together these groups, developing this deep integration, and working towards specific problem solving. So we've identified minimizing damage from flood and storms as the problem we want to tackle, and are looking at it from our multiple disciplinary perspectives and then our shared group understanding.
You know, in North Carolina, we've had tremendous population growth. Now it's not uncommon if we have a huge rain event in Raleigh, North Carolina, further east, southeast, in particular, my district, can sometimes become a flooding event. There are a lot of constituents that I have that look at the rivers, the creeks, the streams, and say, you know, it seems to us that if we would just clean these out, if we would keep them up, the water would have somewhere to go, and we wouldn't endure the flooding events that we've had the last several years. Now, I certainly understand that things can be more complicated than they seem, but it does strike me that there's an element of common sense here that suggests that, you know, many of my constituents are dead on. What type of research, what type of analysis is being done in that regard as it relates to cleaning out the rivers, creeks, and streams? And do we have an ability, and is this what you're really working on, finding the targeted areas where it would be most beneficial to remove debris, et cetera?
So that's not a core focus of the things we're doing right now, but it's certainly something that we think about. And I think you're right that in some cases there are opportunities to improve the situation if there are huge debris dams that are entirely blocking creeks and streams, that can be a way to prevent that obstruction from causing flooding. But it is the case that a lot of the streams and creeks are really flowing fairly well, and that debris removal in and of itself, I don't think is a key answer. I think it is a tool that can be used to solve some problems. People also think about dredging as a tool, and that's been shown to not really develop the new volume of water moving capacity to combat the huge floods that we see now. So certainly, I think we need to consider circumstances where there is really acute blockage of streams and creeks and even rivers. But I don't think that that's probably a core tool for the things that we're thinking about, the magnitudes of the flooding that we are looking at. And an important thing as you get closer to the coast is to remember that removing those obstructions and improving the flow works both ways. So as you have storm surge or as you have water level rise, it's also going to bring the water back up into the land just as well as it takes it off.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rouser. I will yield myself 5 minutes to begin the questioning. Mr. Soroka, you acknowledge that it is now up to the administration and the budget process to implement the spend on the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund balance, the equitable allocation formulas, and the expanded use provisions. But can you discuss why there is need to act quickly, and what does it mean for job creation, addressing the huge backlog of maintenance needs in our economy and our trade?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Acting with urgency and providing certainty will allow for private investment to also happen quicker, provide faster benefits to America's farmers and exporters who need certainty and lower freight costs to compete in the global marketplace. And please remember, with 9.5 million Americans still out of work, this means jobs. Ports around the nation are economic enablers for their surrounding communities and regions. The Port of Los Angeles, as one port, supports 1 in 9 jobs in Southern California and 1.6 million nationwide. Expediting these projects for the nation's ports will allow them to more fully support America's recovery and resurgence.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Strickler, in your testimony, you discussed the great role your state plays in developing, managing, and operating flood control, resiliency, and water resource projects by partnering with the community. How important is the community consultation and resiliency planning on projects, especially in communities historically neglected or disenfranchised?
Madam Chair, thank you for the question, and it's critically important. You know, these communities, many communities along our coasts are in both rural and urban areas, communities that have traditionally been disadvantaged, disenfranchised, whether through redlining or other policies, or simply through economic considerations, and sometimes the lowest lying land and the most vulnerable land is the least expensive land. And getting into those communities, doing significant outreach, not only to inform them about the work that we're doing at the Commonwealth level, but also to get buy-in from the community and understand the types of solutions that those communities want to see in order to survive and thrive into the future is really a core focus of our master planning work.
Thank you very much. Mr. Virginis, your testimony addresses the diverse needs of the communities around the country. Do you believe the Corps needs to do more to implement modern science and technology to address all the modern problems, such as expanded flooding in the east and longer droughts in the west?
Madam Chairwoman, yes, yes, indeed. And the Corps, as I believe your statement had made it clear earlier, they are the preeminent water resource agency in the United States. Yet we have a hurdle of getting that technical assistance to communities. And so while it was a great provision in the Word of 2020, where there's going to be some intentionality on working with rural and economically disadvantaged communities. That's only 10 communities, and that expertise is needed literally by hundreds or thousands of communities. So we need to operationalize that technical assistance by having that disassociated from projects and having core expertise available on the ground when it's needed.
Well, and then would you agree to all the witnesses, much of your testimony concerns the problem the Corps is underfunded to perform many of the necessary concerns and projects across the country? Can you discuss what impact of lack of funding has on flood protection, navigation, and environment? Anybody? The underfunding of the Corps.
Absolutely, and that's why we're absolutely, madam, and that's why we're pushing for these. It's been over a decade that we've had these conversations, and with so much great support of House T&I as well as this subcommittee. So we support that effort as well.
Anybody else? Anybody else?
One thing. Oh,
Okay.
one thing I would add is that the Corps does do a lot of robust research and development. So again, they are continually sharpening their skills and giving us new information. And so that's an area also that is not as funded robustly, is making sure that the Corps itself understands and can use the latest technology.
So it needs to be reprogrammed. Anybody else?
Madam Chair, I would just agree. States like Virginia don't have the benefit of large dedicated funding sources like some of our friends on the Gulf Coast, for example, do. And so, increased core funding and importantly, increasing core funding for states that have taken the proactive steps like we have, putting together thoughtful, forward-looking master planning efforts is really important for us.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. Now I yield to Mr. Babin. You may proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to say thank you to all you witnesses as well. We really appreciate this very important hearing. And thank you again, Madam Chair, for having this. I also want to thank our ranking member, Mr. Rouser, as well. The successful passage of WRDA 2020 is a good example of what we can achieve when we all work together. And I'm very pleased to be talking about it today. As a representative of Southeast Texas, basically from Houston, Texas, over to Louisiana, 9 counties it's comprised of, as well as the economic, the critical elements of my district, as well as the economic health of the state and really the entire country. Without efficient ports, strong inland waterways, and well-built pumps and levees, this country down here would not experience the level of economic success that it has been seeing up to today. My district has 4 ports, including one of the nation's biggest ones, which is the Port of Houston. And the Houston Ship Channel is the busiest U.S. deepwater draft waterway in the country. It is the top export port in the nation, biggest energy port, largest petrochemical refining complex, and largest container port on the Gulf Coast, and the #1 break bulk port in the country. And that is why I'm very pleased to have helped join in the efforts to ensure that provisions supporting the widening and dredging of the Houston Ship Channel passed in 2020 WRDA. This is a critical milestone for this region. And from conversations with the port and companies who utilize this channel to meetings with Secretary James of the Army Corps and leaders at the previous administration's OMB, the Houston delegation and I have bipartisanly supported the channel's expansion project in every way that we possibly could have. And to help complete the approval process, we also secured a New Start designation at the beginning of this year, allowing construction to begin. And that means that we're able to get authorization, appropriation, and a New Start designation all within 1 year. Very rarely to have that happen. Well, we were so happy. But this means that we were able to get this a huge win, not only for advancing our country's energy independence, but also improving our national security, providing goods, services, and what have you for support of our growing economy. One of the challenges, however, that we face down in this Southeast Texas region is the repetitive flooding that so many of my constituents experience on an annual basis now. We have a great opportunity to help mitigate this problem with stronger and improved infrastructure. So I have a question that I'd like to address to Dr. Peeler and also to Mr. Bergenis. Is it not an exaggeration to say that by spending $1 million today on hurricane and flooding prevention infrastructure, that we can save $1 billion on damages down the road from another hurricane, a storm like Hurricane Harvey? If you could both please share your thoughts on this, I would appreciate it.
Sure. I think I would certainly agree with the investment upfront providing a huge return on the back end. The million billion numbers, I wouldn't be entirely certain about. I think it would depend on your investments, but I think it is clear that prevention is a very good investment and that we're in a place where we have a good understanding of what those investments might be.
Right. Thank you. And Mr. Bergenis?
Yes, and I would also concur as well. FEMA continues to do updated studies to show the investment in flood mitigation activities, infrastructure, and such, and they show an excellent return on investment. For flooding measures, I believe it's 8 to 1 in terms of doing that. And the other thing that we need to take into account, and your district certainly knows that well, is to pull out every tool we have in the toolbox. It's infrastructure, it's non-structural, it's some of it even could be codes and standards. We have to use an all the above approach. Thank you.
Great answers, both of you. Thank you so much. And Madam Chair, I'll yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Babin. And
Yes,
the
ma'am.
next we have Mr. Huffman. You may proceed.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for this very important hearing. Last week in the Natural Resources Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife, I chaired a hearing on Building Back Better with a focus on building resiliency for the economy, for climate, and for ecosystems. This is the way we have to approach it these days with climate change, a warming ocean, acidification of our ocean, and of course, rising sea levels. The good news I see is that many of these nature-based solutions we've been talking about will help us solve and confront the climate crisis and get people back to work at the same time. I believe we can promote investments in blue carbon ecosystems and restoration projects that are going to sequester and store carbon while also protecting our coasts from storms. We have an opportunity to build up our working waterfronts, our wetlands, our oyster beds and living shorelines, and restorative aquaculture is very promising. So I have a question for Secretary Strickler, and let me say, Secretary Strickler, it's great to see you again. You were a terrific staffer in the Natural Resources Committee for many years. It's good to see you continuing your great work, and great to have you back in the House of Representatives. You discussed in your testimony the importance of protecting and enhancing green or natural infrastructure like natural coastal barriers and fish and wildlife habitats. But I want to talk a little more specifically about fishing communities and what this means for communities like many of yours in Virginia, like a lot of the ones I represent on the North Coast of California. Can you talk about the multiple economic benefits of how natural infrastructure can provide both coastal resiliency, but also improve aquatic ecosystems and what that means for fish habitat and fishing communities?
Mr. Huffman, it's good to see you as well, and thank you for your kind words. The things that you mentioned here, green infrastructure, blue carbon, enhancing these resources in concert with our resilience efforts are incredibly important for all of coastal Virginia, but specifically for our fishing communities and the folks who depend on ecotourism, coastal tourism, and the like. For example, one of the things you mentioned was oyster reef restoration. We, as part of our Chesapeake Bay restoration effort, have a significant initiative underway to restore oysters in a number of tributaries along the Chesapeake. And those obviously provide the co-benefits of habitat for juvenile fish, but also for wave attenuation and coastal resilience as well. The most significant problem we face in Virginia is something that's, I guess, most easily described is coastal squeeze, where you've got sea level rise and increased coastal hazards on one side versus what has traditionally been thought of as a fixed infrastructure, whether it's homes, businesses, roads on the other side. And as the sea level comes up, it pinches that really, really important coastal habitat, whether it's wetlands, dunes, beaches, or riparian forests. There are our most productive ecosystems for fisheries in particular, but also for wildlife habitat. And that's where we're really going to get hurt. Virginia is incredibly dependent on blue crabs, which are very important for the commercial fishery, but also as forage for a number of other fisheries, including striped bass, which depend heavily on not just the estuary, but the rivers as well for spawning. And so our fisheries ecosystem in the Chesapeake Bay and the coastal Atlantic Ocean would completely collapse if this habitat were to go away. And so what we need to figure out is ways to restore and protect those floodplains, those coastal barriers, those estuarine habitats, while at the same time making our communities more adaptive and resilient to climate change.
I appreciate that. And those fragile estuarine habitats are just as important on the West Coast to our salmon fisheries. So that's it. Before I yield back, Madam Chair, let me just tell the witness, Mr. Bergenis, who brought up Eureka, Missouri. I represent Eureka, California. And it's great to see natural solutions being put to work in Missouri. We're certainly doing our part in California, but from one Eureka representative to another, I appreciated your testimony, and I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Huffman. That's very nice of you. Next, we have Mr. LaMalfa. You may proceed, sir.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to our witnesses in committee today. Dr. Peeler, I have a couple of questions for you at this moment. On issues concerning how Army Corps is working on under a new program to investigate installing more hydropower. Now, we've seen issues where hydropower is not treated very fairly as a form of renewable energy. It seems to be the emphasis is so heavily upon wind and solar, yet those are not 24/7 available sources of power. So Army Corps was instituting a program to promote more of it in rural areas, seeing if existing dams can be refitted or upsized on their hydropower programs. It certainly would mean a lot for the rural economy, like in places like mine, which have a lot of opportunities for expanding hydropower or creating hydropower, and the rural jobs that go with those. Once you build other types of green power, those jobs are dwindled down to virtually nil, as opposed to the power plants, which are permanent infrastructure. So, Dr. Peeler, would you, in the WRDA 2020, there was a provision that would allow non-federal entities to evaluate and plan for whether existing dams could be upgraded, modified to include more hydropower. Do you think that investment in these areas would be something Congress should be emphasizing in comparison to other types of renewable energy?
So I will say that's outside the scope of my expertise and the things that we're focused on in our current work. But I do think that, like any of these proposed projects, it's really important to look at the comprehensive situation and consider everything there is, from environmental to financial, and weigh the decision.
All right, let's shift gears then. We've had some disaster issues in this area. You might recall Oroville Dam, when a spillway infrastructure broke, and a lot of erosion was allowed to get into the river, Feather River, between Oroville and largely the Ute City, Marysville area, and other issues like that, where post forest fires, we have a tremendous amount of erosion that can get into the water, run down the watershed into rivers and streams, etc. Yet there's not much that can seem to be done about that. We should be doing more forest management and more issues to help prevent those things from happening in our waterways. So what I'm getting at is that in the Word of 2020, there was a Section 118 pilot program that can be used to help work on that. Do you believe that would be a very productive way of using that program in Word of 2020?
So from the environmental perspective, excess sediment can be really problematic in aquatic systems. And I think you alluded to the solutions almost always being front-end investment in on-land activities to prevent it from happening. Obviously, in cases like forest fires, it's hard to do. There's not a lot of mitigation against that. But I do think that considering sediment management is critical. As you get to the coast, the dynamic gets a little more complicated because so many of the habitats that we value there rely on a supply of sediment. So it becomes a little more like Goldilocks, where you want the perfect spot, a little bit of sediment, but not too much. But I certainly believe that sediment is a critical factor in aquatic systems, and advancing its management is an important investment.
Yeah, I don't think we're running short of sediment around here. So our rivers and streams have less capacity. Well, the rivers, especially with levees, have less capacity to carry flood water because they're silting up more and more. And the forest situation, for example, up in the upper Placer County area, fire residue has caused one of the dams, at least one of them up there, to have a problem being able to run their hydroelectric system on there because of silting up at the bottom of that. So it indeed does have a big effect. I know there's much done to prevent silting along roadway construction projects with all the wattles and stuff you see. But interestingly, they want to remove the dams up on the Klamath, 3 of them in my district, and they're not accounting for the amount of silt already sitting behind those that would be released into the Klamath River all the way to the ocean, thereby having a devastating impact on the fishery. They don't seem to be talking about that much. So, we got to look at silt from all angles here. So with that, Madam Chair, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. LaMalfa. Now we have Ms. Johnson from Texas. You're on, Eddie Bernice.
Excuse me. Thank you very much, Madam Chair and Ranking Member and Chair of the full committee. This has been a very interesting hearing, and I'd like to ask unanimous consent to put my opening statement in the record. And I simply want to make a statement. I hosted a meeting over a year ago with our North Central Texas COG and all of the stakeholders, and with FEMA, with the Corps of Engineers, our state, city, county level officials, to talk about flooding and prevention, because what we find ourselves doing is constantly cleaning up behind flooding. I'm in North Texas, but we have lots of tributaries from major water streams, and we deal with a lot of flooding. And we have found in working together, which we are still working together, that we can avoid so much cost if we focus on prevention rather than cleanup. And so that is ongoing. And perhaps sometime we can have a hearing that includes some of the Texas activity that's really focused on prevention. And I just wanted to share that with the full committee. We have the largest port. We have many water streams. We are border state. And I think that we have started to look at something very useful for the entire country, for our area, with bringing all these stakeholders together, federal, state, city, and county, as well as 2 major federal agencies with both FEMA and Corps of Engineers, to look at saving money and attempting to work together to avoid some of the flooding damage. So thank you very much, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. And yes, our testimony will be entered into the record. Next we have Mr. Mast. You may proceed.
Thank you, Chairwoman. I appreciate the time. Thank you, everybody, for your testimony. Dr. Peeler, my questions are going to go to you today. I was reading your written testimony as well as listening to you. You spoke about something of particular interest to me, which is what you labeled as harmful algal blooms. I speak to them more so in the terms of toxic algal blooms. I don't know, are you aware that the EPA has put some specific numbers on algal blooms, identifying when they're too toxic for human contact?
I am, yes.
No.
You are. Are you familiar with what those numbers the EPA put out there?
I couldn't, no, I could not provide them right now, but I'm certainly familiar with the new guidance.
Yeah, for microcystin, which is quite often what you get in this blue-green algae, it's 8 parts per billion. They said or 8 micrograms per liter is too toxic for human contact, leading to things from liver failure to death, depending on how much you might ingest for that, and certainly has killed wildlife as well. Do you have any idea of what kind of numbers your area has seen?
I think that no, not specifically, but certainly we've had problems with toxin producing species, and I've done some work in Florida that on similar species.
Where did you do that work in
So
Florida?
it's in
Obviously, that's my backyard.
Lake George. Yep. So leading up to Jacksonville.
Sure. There's a lot of folks that do this issue from Louisiana to Ohio, Michigan, Florida, and other places. Not always that the issue is dealt to you by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So in my community, I actually have a situation where every year we can pretty much count on the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers taking algal blooms that you already talked about, you know, the numbers of where they're toxic at about 8 parts per billion, that are measuring somewhere around 400 to 600 parts per billion. So extremely toxic, taking them out of one water body and moving them to an entirely separate community by canals that they dug. How would you feel if that was going on in your community?
I think that's one of those tough situations where we have a solution to a past problem that's creating a new challenge, and we need to rethink the solution.
Can you expand on that a little more? That seemed like a lot of ambiguous terms, not terribly specific.
So I think about our work where we look at things like stormwater drainage systems, which were a remarkable early resilient strategy. And now as water levels high, some of those stormwater drains don't work as they once did. And so they end up being a problem that creates new flooding. So if you have a situation where you're managing water in one way, thinking about like an estuary where originally in the 80s we were looking at phosphorus. If you do a really great job managing phosphorus, you can end up moving your problem farther downstream in an estuary where you have those same algal blooms and they're then limited by nitrogen. So I think it's a case where occasionally solutions create unexpected problems.
I think we're all experienced to that on the Water Resources Subcommittee, to previous solutions creating future problems. Probably one of the most bipartisan issues that we all deal with on this committee. I'd ask you this pointed question. You think the Corps of Engineers has the right to poison communities?
I think that's not I mean, I don't know that I think anybody should be poisoning anyone, but I would have to understand the situation a little more specifically.
No doubt all these situations have their different idiosyncrasies, but we should be able to agree at a certain level that nobody has the right to poison us as individuals. And certainly as an overseer of government, that should be a basic premise of good government, that we not allow government to poison communities. Would you agree with that?
Sorry, just having a clicking on. Yes, no.
Doctor, you're muted.
I definitely subscribe to the do no harm philosophy for sure.
Very good. Do you think that the Corps of Engineers should be allowed to exempt themselves from different provisions of the Clean Water Act?
Again, I would need more context. I do think that there are reasons for all sorts of decisions, and I wouldn't want to say specifically.
Very good. I appreciate your answering my questions today. I just have one quick question, Madam Chairwoman, if you need the answer to this. As we're speaking about WRDA, is the Clean Water Act and Waters of the U.S. planning to be opened up in WRDA 2022?
That I would have to defer to staff to see where they're at with that.
Thank you, ma'am. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Mr. Mast. Mr. Garamendi, you may proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and for you and your leadership, Peter, and the ranking members. Thank you for last year's WRDA. We're going to have a big task this year, monitoring the implementation of a whole series of very, very important elements in that legislation. I want to speak to two of them in the next few moments. First of all, the harbor maintenance program, really good work. We're going to get the money. How are we going to use it? And this is a question for Mr. Soroka. Should we allow that money to be used beyond the immediate water, beyond the actual structures on the water, dealing with some of the access as well as acquisition of property to maintain the integrity of the ports?
In short, Congressman Garamendi, no. We believe that the funds should be used in the water for maintenance, and those examples would include specifically the replacement elements to our berthing structures, the timber fender piles replacement that not only need maintenance but upgrading and modernization, and of course the seismic work that we need to do. Like we're doing with marine oil terminals here in the state of California, across all cargo terminals.
Very good. Then I suppose sea level rise would also fit into that same equation. Thank you very much for your answer.
That's
My
correct.
next question goes to Mr. Virginius, the state floodplain managers. I was taken by your testimony and frankly quite enthusiastic about all of the additional ways we can deal with flooding, setbacks, and so forth. It turns out that you may be in a situation where you want to do something on one hand and then the other hand going in the different direction. Specifically, we've introduced legislation, Mr. LaMaffa and I introduced legislation on the floodplain insurance programs for farmers, that the National Flood Insurance Program be designed in such a way as to encourage agriculture in the floodplains. However, you oppose that legislation. Could you explain why?
To my recollection, on that legislation, one of the components that was problematic was to exempt certain buildings, like farmstead buildings, for example, not necessarily equipment, from things like the elevation requirement. And one of the things that we have to draw a line for is ensuring the public health and safety. And farmers are not unlike anybody else in the country who are facing threats from climate change and sea level rise. And we need to, instead of exempting them, what we need to do is provide them assistance through mitigation programs or something to actually help them comply with those types of things.
Perhaps you ought to come to the Sacramento Valley and take a look at what you just described. We could probably take these. Some of these are historic buildings, farm buildings, houses that have been there for generations. And you want to put them maybe 15 feet into the air. I think you need to take a look at this. I would appreciate very much working with you so that you gain a full understanding of what your opposition really means. If we cannot provide flood insurance for agriculture in all of its various ways, not only the farm buildings, but also the homesteads, then you're simply going to drive agriculture out of the floodplain. Now, maybe that's what you want to do, but I would suggest that one of the best uses for the floodplains, aside from setbacks and natural environments, is agriculture.
Absolutely, and we would welcome working with you and understanding the unique problem there, because there are a lot of solutions that can at least even get you partially protected and partial resiliency, and partial is even better than nothing. The point is that we definitely want to ensure some level of resiliency and protection so that they survive the next storm. And so we would be happy to work with you on that. Thank you.
Good. I'm sure Mr. Lamaffa and I would welcome you when COVID pandemic allows us. We'll show you a floodplain where your policy is exactly in the wrong direction.
Okay.
Okay. With that, I'm going to thank you, Madam Chair, for what is a very important hearing. Look forward to working with you and the committee on the implementation of the extraordinary work that was done in the last WRDA. Thank you. You're back.
Thank you for your pardon, Mr. Garamendi. Appreciate it. And now we move to Mr. Mace. You're recognized. Is Mr. Mace available? Then we
Mrs.
go to
Mace.
Mr. Westerman. Oh, you are Mace? Mr. Mace?
No, no, no. I was just saying that's Nancy Mace, Mrs. Mace.
Oh, Mrs.
Mace.
Mace. Okay, yes, and I'm sorry, Mrs. Mace. Is she on? If not, we'll proceed to Mr. Westerman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good to see you, and it was such a pleasure to work with you on the WRDA 2020 as the ranking member on the subcommittee, and I know Ranking Member Rouser will do probably a much better job than I did working with you to get WRDA 2022. Mr. Bergenis, you talked about the need for the Corps to share their expertise, to consult with folks, with communities, even with if the projects they're working on aren't part of a specific authorized project. And I know we're, again, barely a few months into WRDA 2020, but thinking about the future of WRDA 22, can you further outline how you think Congress should direct the Corps to undertake more of this technical assistance role? I'm especially interested in how we can assist the Corps in doing that when I hear all about current backlog maintenance and other projects sitting on the shelf, away from money and manpower to complete.
Certainly. So in our written testimony, in fact, one of the things that we were struck by is a something on the Corps website that even talked about this uniqueness. But we actually have some good models in federal government right now. The Natural Resource Conservation Service is one that comes to mind. So in NRCS, you actually have staff funded through the NRCS that are your district conservationists, that they're your area conservationists. These are people that if you have one of those communities that just had a flood and say, hey, I'm looking at some solutions, I don't need a big study, they could call them up and they could actually go to a public meeting or to a council meeting. And right now, the dynamic that we have is that you really can't do that with Corps staff. And yet they need to be at the table. And so whether it's NRCS, USGS also has water science centers in a lot of the states. And again, they have staff that are able to do that. I think what it requires from the Corps standpoint is to provide the funding generally for technical assistance and making sure that every district actually has staff that are able to provide that as needed.
So how do we address that manpower issue with the Corps? Do you think they have the resources there to do this extra work if they had the funding, or do we need to look at that in more detail?
Well, I believe like Chairwoman Napolitano had indicated, the Corps does not have the funding right now to do that, and they certainly need extra resources. And on the authority, I'll leave it for y'all to figure that out. But certainly extra resources to do that.
And could that even be something that's maybe contracted out to other professionals through the Corps to provide the community assistance?
You know, looking at other federal agencies where this is successful, they typically don't contract that out because they are contracting out the larger projects in the work. But like for instance, in NRCS, and I was a county planner in a rural county in Ohio, and your NRCS people actually become trusted resources in the community. So As you know, solving flood issues also requires an amount of trust between the government and the community. And so, by having it as staff, I think you end up building a history and some trust as well.
All right, that's all I had, Madam Chair. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Westerman, and I agree with you. The funding is a big issue. Mr. Lowenthal, you may proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'd like to thank you and the bipartisan members of this committee, and you and Chairman Fazio for word of trust, especially the part around the Convergence Trust Fund. You did an excellent job, and Mr. Soroka, you explained it very clearly in your presentation. You explained clearly about the expanded use, the importance of the expanded use, about the fair and equitable distribution. You also talked about how the distribution of the funds was fair for everyone in the process. And it was a very, very good presentation. I have a few other, while we have you here, Mr. Soroka. And I want to thank you for Gene, for your great work at Port of Los Angeles. You know, I was at Port of Long Beach. And one of the interesting questions that I have here, while I have you here, is that, there have been some recent articles about the backups at our nation's ports, and especially stories about ships that are out at anchor outside of both the Port of LA and the Port of Long Beach. I can actually see them as I leave my house. I live right near Ocean Boulevard in Long Beach. But we also have reports of ships returning to Asia without agriculture. And Chairman DeFazio recently wrote with the bipartisan leadership of this of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, sent a letter to the Federal Maritime Commission to express our concern about ocean carriers prioritizing foreign goods and leaving limited shipping capacity for U.S. exports. So the backup log, the what's taking place potentially, we're not sure. Do you have any recommendations, both short-term and long-term, to help address this tremendous surge of imports and what that has done in terms of our national supply chain and how we're going to deal with this tremendous rise in imports? Mr. Soroka?
Thank you, Congressman Lowenthal. Always good to see you. Yes, we do have some specific recommendations. These past months, we've seen an import buying surge that's been pandemic induced. Internet sales have doubled over the last year, where it took 10 years to reach only 10% of national retail sales. So we've seen the change in the American consumer, and that probably won't go away anytime soon, but we are looking into the future for when the country begins to open up and we start spending discretionary income on services. But to answer your question directly, number one, we must vaccinate all of our port workers. There are about 100,000 folks that come to work at this port complex every day, and we've only begun to scratch the surface. And these, in addition to dock workers, are truck drivers, warehouse workers, terminal operators, construction and maintenance teams across the board. So much more has to be done in this area to get inventory and qualifications supported to get shots in these arms. Secondly, we have to ask our importers to pick up their cargo. Warehouses from the shores of the Pacific to the Mojave Desert, more than 2 billion square feet of space, are overflowing with cargo. Partially because we don't have enough workers on the job, but more importantly, we have to push this cargo through the system to the interior of the United States, and that starts with importers of record picking up their cargo here at the Port of Los Angeles. And lastly, we have to segment our cargo to make sure that the products that are moving out to the Inland Empire can be done with lower times of congestion and traffic on our roadways and freeways. We've got to be more succinct, and all of that is accomplished by increasing participation in our nation's only port community system, the Port Optimizer. Sharing data across stakeholder groups and participants of private and public sector both are the answer to times like this when port congestion slows down. But in finally answering this question, sir, what we also have seen is a 50% increase in productivity of our vessel work. Pre-pandemic, we were averaging about 10 ships at the Port of Los Angeles every day. Today, we're averaging 15 ships. And on this very Tuesday, we have 17 container ships in port that our longshore men and women are working around the clock to get the cargo out to U.S. consumers.
Thank you for that very complete answer and understanding where our ports are today, especially the major ports of the West Coast. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lowenthal, and we will now proceed to Mr. Weber. You may proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Lots of good stuff here today. Lots of good stuff. One of the questions I have for the whole panel is that resilience has been suggested that it equals natural or non-structural solutions to future risks. But it's clear that resilience can mean a whole lot more than that, and it is basically not what we would call a one-size-fits-all approach. So I'll give this over to the panel, and I'm going to ask a couple of things. Well, first of all, let's just do it this way. Talk about this, and then I'll ask you a follow-up question. So we'll start with whoever wants to start with that question. It's not a one-size approach. Do we work with local communities? Is it critical that we work with local communities? Do we have project sponsors? Do we bring them all together? I know our great chairwoman from science talked about having meetings in Texas with flood people. Can we do that with the resilience with local communities? What do y'all say about that approach?
Yes, sir. So resilience, as you said, it is not a one-size-fits-all approach, and it really is all the tools in the toolbox. It can certainly be non-structural and nature-based, but it also can be structures, and it can be and protecting buildings and critical infrastructure and so on. The importance, I think, of having that dialogue with the community is to exchange understanding, because what we're seeing in resilience is there's a lot of active research going on. There's two new technologies being applied. There are new techniques of resilience being invented, and we need to understand all the resilience techniques so that we can apply the right tools to a given community situation.
Chad, are we getting, well, I'll go on to the next witness and I'll ask the follow-up question. Who wants to weigh in?
Yeah, I also think, sir, that we need.
Go ahead, Matt. Strickler, go ahead.
All right, sorry about that. Congressman, I appreciate your question. In Virginia, we have a lot of different coastal environments and inland environments, and we know that there are certain critical infrastructure assets and certain communities that, the only option is to shelter those in place. And we're going to have massive engineering solutions in order to protect those assets and protect the local and regional economies and the communities that they that they support. At the same time, there's not enough money, and there'll never be enough money to pour enough concrete for us to armor our whole shoreline, nor would we want to. And that's why Virginia is actually building its approach to coastal resilience after the Texas coastal master plan. There were a lot of great ideas in that plan. And we really like the regional approach. We really like the balance and the ranking of projects, both green infrastructure solutions and green gray concepts, as well as traditional hardened projects that we need to make coast more resilient.
All right. And Mr. Farouk, I think you wanted to weigh in.
Yes, Congressman. In addition to what some of us traditionally talk about with respect to resilience on energy and our environmental stewardship, two other pieces also come to mind for consideration of this body. One is cyber resilience. As we look at the threats that we've received, they have doubled now since the beginning of the pandemic to an average of 40 million cyber intrusion attempts per month here at the nation's largest port. And lastly, we need labor resilience as well. We need to make sure that we can build skill and train the next generation of worker in and around this supply chain, from the docks to the administrators to those who will design, develop, and build our nation's infrastructure.
All right, I'm running out of time, so I want to go back to the three of you. I want to grade. How are we doing on getting that word out? Resilience, working with local communities, and moving that process forward. Are we getting a report card? Is it a C, a D minus, a B minus? What do you think, Mr. Sirocco? I'll come back to you.
C minus at this point. We need more traction, and it begins at the federal level to help set the tone for us at the local level.
All right, Mr. Bergenis, how about you?
I would give it about the same grade. You hear excellent examples like in Virginia right now, but those examples are too few and the need is too great. We've got to accelerate it.
Okay, Mr. Strickler, did you ever have a teacher that graded on the curve? I'm hoping you did.
I did, yes, sir. But I would tend to agree. We're a little below average here across the board. We have some communities in Virginia that are out in front, Virginia Beach, Norfolk, with robust plans. Many other communities that lack the capacity that are nowhere right now.
All right, I appreciate that, Madam Chair. Thank you for your indulgence. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Weber, for your part in it. Next, we have Mr. Pappas. You may proceed. Mr. Pappas? If not, we move on to Mr. Carvajal.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is to Mr. Bergenis. In 2019, one of your colleagues, Mr. Pineda, came before our subcommittee and talked about the need for the Army Corps of Engineers to take an enhanced role in providing technical assistance to help local sponsors move forward with their projects and incorporate resiliency into their planning. As a former local government official, this was something that really resonated with me, and I was proud to work with Chairwoman Napolitano and Chairman DeFazio to include a provision in the 2020 WRDA bill under Section 111 to allow the Corps to provide technical assistance to non-federal partners for resiliency planning. How can we build on this provision to ensure we are achieving our goal of building back better and promoting more resilient infrastructure in order to withstand the threats of climate change?
I think the primary way you could do this, and this was in Ricardo's testimony, and it's in our testimony even today, is to better operationalize that through technical assistance that's not associated with specific projects. Again, the demand is great out there. I've worked with the NFIP, and I know, for instance, there's over 22,000 NFIP communities. And there is a tremendous need out there, as was stated just earlier in the Commonwealth of Virginia. There's some areas that are leading the nation and some areas that haven't started. So we need to make the ability to provide that resilience planning assistance. We need to make that something where literally that local official could call their local district who might be trusted and say, you know what, can you come to a meeting with our planning team? Can you do this? And they can do that without having to deal with charging it to a specific project.
Thank you. Mr. Bergenis, to continue with you, I also want to ask about the importance of including resilience and natural infrastructure in how the Army Corps calculates benefit cost ratios. As you know, the Army Corps of Engineers has a significant backlog. In my district alone, the Mission Creek Flood Control Project has been in the works since the late 1960s. However, my community has struggled to receive federal construction dollars, despite the numerous benefits the project would provide. Do you have any suggestions as to how Congress can help tackle this problem to ensure that we are accounting for the numerous environmental benefits a project may bring?
Yes, sir, Congressman. I think one of the things, and it was a comment made earlier, but really resonated with me, that a reason to address and evaluate the existing backlog is to ensure that we are accounting for all the environmental benefits in the way we know how to today. You know, that backlog has spanned, I believe, the 2020 WRDA put a cutoff at 1985. But, you know, I just think about all the advances, even in the last 10 years, when it comes to being able to quantify and to calculate environmental benefits, and how many of those projects are pre that time where we might need to go back and recalculate those. And I suspect that in the case of Mission Creek, if all that backlog was evaluated and you had multiple other environmental benefits, that would put it higher in the queue.
Thank you. Well, can you elaborate a little bit more on that? Because that has been the challenge, coming up with a new framework or an additional value priority that would raise those environmental benefits. How specifically might we be able to do that?
Well, I think in one way, the 2020 WRDA started that by providing some congressional direction in evaluating and reevaluating the backlog. But then I think the second way is is really bringing to fruition the PRNG, where the PRNG is really that vehicle, I think, to account for those newest approaches in counting environmental benefits and making sure those are part of projects. So again, the 2020 WRDA addressed, I think, that issue in two important ways.
Great. Thank you. And lastly, Mr. Soroka, I have limited time, but I want to ask my question. Our subcommittee under Chairwoman Napolitano and Chairman DeFazio has prioritized fair and equitable distribution of the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund. This is particularly important for ports throughout California and in my district. Can you discuss the priorities you think would be helpful to ports throughout the country, as many are also under additional stress due to COVID pandemic?
Yes, Congressman. What we see is the Port of Los Angeles is a jobs multiplier. As we build and develop this port, it makes us more competitive to move more cargo, passenger ships, and bulk products, which also create more jobs for those in and around the port complex and the supply chain. Part of our STEM outreach is to get kids in the younger brackets of school, train them up and make them aware of what opportunities may exist here at this port and beyond. So we believe that equitable distribution of work carries on to our communities as well.
Thank you very much. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Carvajal, for your comments, and you went over a little time, but that's okay. Next, we have Mr. Garrett Graves. Mr. Graves, you may proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's nice to see you again. So my first question is for Mr. McGinnis. The Disaster Recovery Reform Act made some modifications to the utilization of HMGP funds to allow for those funds to be used for authorized Corps of Engineer projects, which, as we know, are the most scrutinized projects in the federal government. I understand that NEMA opposed that, and I'm really curious as to why you would oppose commingling funds that were available to advance whatever priorities a state decides are the top priorities.
Just one thing: we are not NEMA; we're ASFPM. So I just want to say that for the record.
That was my bad. I was thinking about it here last week. I apologize. Yes, you all, no. but you guys did too.
Yeah.
Could you please explain?
So what we know with HMGP in every state is that we have an oversubscribed program, and so what that means is even in those states where there's a backlog of core projects, we also have a huge demand for the traditional things that HMGP has funded. Primarily a lot of the non-structural types activities, as well as some of the small structural activities. And so our concern and our opposition came from the standpoint that you have an authority with through WRDA and through the Corps of Engineers to fund those kinds of projects, and we're just trying to still address the need that exists out there in HMGP for those other preferences within those states.
Thank you. I appreciate the answer. As a former practitioner on these types of projects, I just and having spent many years on the ground addressing this, I couldn't disagree more with the position. I think that it's a myopic view, and where this decision needs to be made, as we discussed at our hearing last week, where NEMA actually was, it was discussing how there's so many different funding sources, and we need to allow the states to prioritize what's most important to them, regardless of the funding stream. And we shouldn't have all these disjointed funding streams. If you get a better return on investment, whether it's green, gray, whatever it is, states should be able to make the decision to prioritize those dollars in that direction and commingling the funds. Similarly, Corps of Engineers has a backlog of, by some estimates, $95 billion, which I think would probably exceed some of the other needs in other programs. But let me pivot over. Mr. Strickler, it's nice to see you again. Mr. Secretary, I want to verify that you're under oath right now. I'm just kidding. Don't answer that.
Yes, sir.
No, seriously, I'm curious. You talked about some of the needs for the state of Virginia and taking on this very audacious goal of developing a resiliency program, a coastal master plan. In regard to implementation, looking across the federal government, which program do you see as being most efficient in actually delivering results?
So, Congressman Graves, it's good to see you again, and I just want to ask you, sure you don't want to ask me about red snapper? With Congressman Lowenthal here and Huffman, I thought maybe we'd get into that today. But anyway, no, it's a great question. And to your first question, aligning all of these programs is important. You've got hazard mitigation grant program. You've got community development block grant resilience program. You've got the direct spending from the Corps. You've got the NOAA coastal programs. All of these are important. And aligning those in a way that states can leverage all that money together, to your point, particularly states that have these well thought out resilience plans, in a way that we can prioritize that funding to meet those needs that have been identified, by states in consultation with the communities and also our federal partners. So I hate to give you a non-answer, but there are many different programs we'd like to leverage, and the point I guess I want to make is that we want to try to align all of those to get the maximum benefit.
Thank you. I appreciate the response. Look, I just want to make note that we're in Louisiana, unfortunately, as you know, as a result of Hurricane Katrina, we had some really brutal lessons learned there, and we're probably 15 years or so ahead. We've dedicated billions of dollars in state funds, as I think you indicated, to our coastal program. I really would encourage you to look at implementation issues, problems, because it's going to be one thing to have a plan, but if you can't implement it, it's going to be another pretty big problem. Ms. Bucci, just very quickly, could you quickly address your thoughts on implementation of Corps of Engineer projects and perhaps efficiencies that could be incorporated?
Well, I think that it's very important that the Corps that the industry gets full and efficient funding in terms of the projects that are out there. So that we're getting projects done in years instead of decades. So with this new 65-35 cost change, we need to make sure we use the entire trust fund balance and get all the projects. We're going to have some openings in the next couple of years as Lower Mon gets done and Chickamauga and Kentucky Lock and Dam shortly thereafter. We want to make sure that we keep moving down the capital development strategy, the 15 projects, and just get them done in a matter of years instead of decades. So full and efficient funding is probably the best thing they need to do.
Great. Thank you. Madam Chair, I want to thank you for the extra few seconds there. And I want to make note, all these people keep talking about Texas. Louisiana's got the best coastal master plan in the country. Dr. Pillar, check it out.
Thank you very much, Mr. Graves. Now we're proceeding to Ms. Norton. You are recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for this very important hearing. I've got several questions. Let's see how many of I can get in. First, for Ms. Bucci. I'm interested in our waterways because I live here, of course. I represent the district, and the whole National Capital Region is full of congestion. What do you see as the biggest roadblock to achieving the goal of using the waterways to reduce congestion, given your experience with our inland water system?
Well, first of all, I think you're absolutely right. We need to find a way to get those domestic trailers and international trailers on the international waterways. It's going to take a little bit of infrastructure at different terminals, A lot of the inland river terminals are only used to handling bulk. We're working closely. Merit's very proactive on this, and if we can find freight that's not moving on the rivers, we can get into different programs with some federal assistance in handling container or palletized cargo at different terminals. I think it's important to look at the distances that the containers travel. A lot of times people have talked about container and barge and going from Pittsburgh to New Orleans, which is a long distance and a long travel time. If maybe you shorten it and go from Pittsburgh to Morgantown, West Virginia, or East Liverpool, Ohio, where you're taking it off local highways and shorter distances, and the freight's arriving a little more efficiently. But I think it's going to take some training and the proper equipment, and obviously educating the public that handles these containers and these shippers that there's a mode that's underutilized in our system that can take trucks off the road and save some of the highway construction costs.
Oh, thank you. Mr. Strickler, you're the Secretary of Natural Resources in Virginia, so this question is for you. It's about regional cooperation to address flooding and resiliency. Are there any ongoing regional efforts in the district in Maryland that you could highlight? If not, should there be?
Congresswoman Norton, thank you for your question. The answer is that we collaborate with Maryland and the district on a number of initiatives, particularly in transportation infrastructure. Our biggest collaboration in an area in my secretariat that we're trying to build more resilience and more flood protection type activities into is the work that we do together under the Chesapeake Bay program. As you know, things like stormwater infrastructure, riparian buffers, restoration of wetlands and floodplains are as critical to water quality and habitat for bay species as they are to coastal resilience. And so I'm actually the chair right now of the principal staff committee, and Governor Northam is the chair of the executive council. And we're working very closely with Mayor Bowser and others to try to build those priorities into the Bay program work, and importantly, build in a stronger acknowledgement of the challenges that we face because of climate change in general. So yes, we're working hard on all.
Thank you for that answer, Mr. Peeler. My friends on the other side seem to think that there's no financial cost to inaction or to failing to act on climate change. Of course, we've seen in this region that's not true, because some of our federal buildings have been damaged by flooding, including the National Archives. In your testimony, you say your organization uses models that link environmental change to financial risk. I would love to hear more about that and how we can learn how that information could be used in practice. Those models can be used in practice.
Sure, I'd be happy to provide more information. So the example that I'm talking about today is around flooding in mostly coastal systems, but some of the inland systems in North Carolina, and thinking about ways to fully describe the impacts and the costs of those events. And so I alluded to the incorporating social science, which is really, really important, because the water alone doesn't tell the story of the impacts of flooding. You need to know what people are experiencing. But the coupling of the financial models and the environmental systems is a great way when you have really dynamic systems. We talked about hydropower a little bit earlier. That system has been applied to looking at environmental change that supplies the water to areas in and around hydropower facilities, and the financial connections to the energy sector. So it's, I think, a pretty portable system and can be applied to a range of different questions, but is a really great direct connection between those financial systems, whether they be things like insurance or whether they be things like a private industry, to a very variable environmental setting. And so clearly flooding is something that has a lot of variability around it, and is something that we would really benefit from understanding both the natural side of it and then its connection to financial systems.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for that answer.
You're very welcome, Ms. Norton. And last but not least, Mr. Ketko, you may proceed.
It's very good to see you again, my friend, Mr. Napolitano, and it's good to see everyone here on this hearing. Very important topic for my area. Part of my district has the southern shore of Lake Ontario, and we do some policy changes in the previous administration. We've experienced some catastrophic flooding over the last several years. Mr. McGinnis, in your testimony, you touch on the impact that resiliency measures in one community can have on the surrounding region. In my district, this is made even more complicated because resiliency measures deployed in Canada have to inform our response on Lake Ontario's southern shoreline, which includes part of my district. Can you discuss why federal leadership is important to addressing the issue throughout the Great Lakes? And what do you think can be done to promote a coordinated approach throughout our region?
Absolutely. One of the philosophical underpinnings of a cooperative approach to floodplain management is federal leadership. Because federal leadership then it sends a signal to states and also to communities that this is the direction we need to be going, whether it's investments, whether it's programs and those kinds of things. And certainly in the Great Lakes, I've spent all my career in Great Lakes states, either in Ohio and Wisconsin. I recall when the Great Lakes Compact was first conceived, I believe in the late 1990s or 2000s. And then having that by country coordination becomes important as well. So it's one of those things we absolutely concur. And given again where your district is also you essentially are dealing with a border of another country, it is absolutely critical.
So what can we do to make it a better process than we have right now? Is there something we can help you with in that regard?
Well, I think in terms of federal leadership, one of the things that can be strengthened and that has fallen off in recent years is federal interagency coordination. So you have interagency mechanisms like the Federal Interagency Floodplain Management Task Force, the Mitigation Federal Leadership Group, and also I think day one in President Biden's administration is the reinstatement of Executive Order 13690 on floodplain management. Each of those requires federal agencies to work and to talk with each other. And I have to say, it was difficult before COVID and probably during COVID. Right now, it is really difficult to foster interagency coordination. So I think one thing that can be done and can be done rapidly is to be intentional and making sure our federal agencies are coordinating and working with each other.
All right, great. I appreciate that. Mr. Soroka, I appreciate that you discussed the importance of Great Lakes funding in your testimony. And as I brought up, my district has seen a significant shortfall in federal resources for port and harbor maintenance in recent years, including for projects that are already underway. And the Port of Oswego, which is in my district, is a great example of that. In your conversations with other ports, how common are these problems? And do you expect that 2020 will make a significant strides in addressing them?
Yes, I do, for the following reasons, and good to see you again, Congressman. The framework, we believe, addresses the traditional dredge ports as well as respecting the needs of the emerging harbors, donor and energy ports, as well as the Great Lakes port system.
Okay, and like for example, my port, Oswego, we're simply trying to get the darn thing dredged so we can have bigger ships come in, and it's been like pulling teeth. So is there something more that we can be doing using some of the help with the 2020? Is there something else we should be doing to help them?
Yeah, I believe, and this is an aspiration, but moving forward, we need a national freight strategy, including dedicated funding for multimodal infrastructure, investment in digital infrastructure and cyber, as well as clean technology and workforce development. This is a great first step from the port community into what we need overall as a nation to raise our level of competitiveness.
All right, thank you very much, gentlemen, and thank you all for your testimony. And thank you, Mr. Napolitano, for having this great hearing, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Katko. It's wonderful testimony. It brings up a lot of points that we need to ponder and make sure that we address in the future. In closing, I ask unanimous consent to add into the records the statement by the National Wildlife Federation and the National Sandstone and Gravel Association. I also ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such a time as the witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may have been submitted to them in writing. And also unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments, information submitted by the members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. And without objection, so ordered. I would very much like to thank Chairman DeFazio, Mr. Rouso, and our respected staff for a bipartisan effort on all the past WORDAs. This is marvelous, and you've heard the proceeds, the benefits, and the great work that is being done by the Corps. I also want to thank all the witnesses for their valuable testimony and a lot of insight that we need to look at. Thank the members for participating today, all members that attended. I'm very grateful to you. So that without objections, if no other members have anything to add, the committee stands adjourned. Thank you and goodbye.